regulation incentives for network loss reduction. As you indicated, the topic has been gaining increasing attention over the past years, not in the least driven by the renewed energy efficiency directive. Today, I would like to start with the agenda on the following topics: linking energy efficiency and network loss reduction in Europe, followed by proceedings on a brief recap on grid regulation frameworks. And finally, the actual topic of incentivizing energy efficiency in networks, both through financial incentives or non-financial incentives. The energy efficiency and network loss reduction, as mentioned, has been put on the agenda as network losses comprise of significant volumes and as such hamper energy efficiency of the system as a whole, and accordingly they directly relate to the energy efficiency targets as laid down in the third energy package. So basically what we're looking at is a series of energy policy targets for 2020 that relate to greenhouse gas emissions, sourcing energy demand with renewable energy, and increasing energy efficiency, also known by 2020 targets. Of course, the electricity sector is a pivotal segment in this set of targets, not in the least because also additional electrification of end-use applications is projected for the years to come, and we're in the process of resorting to cost-effective options for renewable deployment. With respect to electricity grids and energy efficiency, we can state that technical electricity network losses are a very significant component to, if you like, overall demand for power. Some 7% of the electricity is lost in transmission and distribution networks, and roughly 1 to 3% of this is in transmission, and in distribution grids we see much higher levels that can even go up to about 11-12%. Accordingly, we can conclude that losses are a critical element in the sector's energy efficiency balance. So this clearly outlines the relevance of grid losses in the context of the energy policy targets, but it also relates to the topic of the costs that these losses induce for society as a whole. We see generation costs related to the compensation required are borne by society, and of course environmental costs associated with this power generation are essentially borne by society as well. Now the question then is, how do we facilitate investment in energy efficient grid technologies, and to this end one will need to have a closer look at the energy efficiency policies and grid regulation as a general framework. So energy policies have been adopted over the past years, directly linking to energy efficiency in the Energy Efficiency Directive. And this essentially sets out the legislative framework for energy efficiency targets, and particularly Article 15, which requests national regulators to take into account energy efficiency, which is required to offer concrete measures by 2015. For grid regulation, it should be acknowledged that there's different frameworks involved with grid regulation, and accordingly, incentives for such should be assessed in relation to such different methodologies. So in the following topic, we will briefly recap the archetypes in regulation encountered, where in particular we will take a closer look at the main archetypes that we encounter in the European continent. Grid regulation is developed in order to account for the notion that transmission and distribution businesses constitute a natural monopoly, and accordingly, and in contrast to generation and retail, competition is hampered in such contexts. Regulation shall therefore be in place to ensure reasonable pricing and efficient operation at reasonable and adequate quality levels. And this relates to the protection of consumer interests on the one hand, but also the financial viability of the industry. Further, of course, the conditions should be equal to the different participants in the sector. So, different frameworks that have been carved out for price regulation approaches are probably within a spectrum that is spanned by, on the one hand, rate of return regulation, and on the other hand, cap regulation, where rate of return regulation is based on pricing that represents the costs involved with the operation of grids, and in addition, a fair rate of return. It requires frequent regulatory reviews because it's essentially a pass-through mechanism of costs, and as such, it also represents or offers limited incentives for efficiency improvements. On the other hand, cap regulation establishes an upper limit on prices or revenues, and requires explicit productivity gains via the price formula, also represented by the X factor. If the regulated entity succeeds in surpassing the required efficiency gains, these result in returns that may be retained by the regulated entity, and as such it provides strong incentives for efficiency improvements. One variant here is the so-called yardstick regulation framework, which relates closely to cap regulation. It decouples individual costs from the allowed prices, though, as it is essentially based on the performance of the regulated industry as well, or parties at the forefront of performance. Like cap regulation, it provides strong incentives for efficiency improvements, but the effects are thought to be somewhat more similar to the dynamics of competition. So these two extremes may be illustrated on the basis of the figures given in this slide. where on the left-hand side rate of return is shown. Pricing is shown to be based on the return on capital, the operating costs, and depreciation. Whereas on the right-hand side, we see cap regulation, where the targets may be based on current levels, including, in addition, inflation and the required productivity growth. And as shown on the right-hand side, if actual costs of the regulated entity turn out to be lower, an efficiency gain results, and a margin can be retained by the regulated entity. Now, how do energy efficiency incentives fit into such frameworks? We can see in the next slide that one important concept here would be the so-called project perspective, where we need to take a closer look at the balance between the increase in capital expenditures and the resulting reduction of operational costs. So here one may think of the higher expenditures related to energy efficient equipment on the one hand, but the lowering of the related operational costs. As such, basically the life cycle costs are central to the evaluation, and that's where also the regulated environment becomes relevant, because this should enable a reasonable trade-off between CapEx and OpEx in order to incentivize the TSOs or DSOs to make decisions on the basis of life cycle costs. Now, for rate of return, we've seen that pass-through items, if we assume the archetype of rate of return regulation, in principle, costs are passed through. So as such, it would be reasonable to state that non-financial incentives are maybe the most appropriate. Whereas for cap regulation, financial incentives and non-financial incentives may be considered. So taking a closer look at cap regulation, one may state the price formula or the price control formula to follow a general structure where CapEx and OpEx are two basic elements, where OpEx is subjected to the X factor. And if network loss reductions are to be considered, it should be an element that affects both CapEx and the OpEx savings. So presumably, we should be looking for the retention of the savings on OpEx that they may be inducing. In several regulatory frameworks, it's also possible that procurement of losses is left to suppliers, and as such, the costs associated therewith are passed through to suppliers or retailers. In which case, obviously, the accounting does not occur in the TSO's domain and DSO's domain. So in this case, an explicit incentive term might be included. As far as the OpEx are involved, we should here distinguish between the controllable and non-controllable elements, where controllable elements are subjected to the X factor, whereas non-controllable are typically passed through. And also for CAPEX, we should make a distinction between allowed costs and elements that are not part of the allowed costs, where typically the allowed costs would allow a return on capital. Now, in this respect, we may distinguish essentially three models. The first one being the building blocks model, where a separate assessment of CAPEX and OPEX is part of the framework, and in which case the regulator actually assesses the CAPEX expenditures and projections thereof, while in terms of OPEX, often benchmarking is applied. Now, controllable OPEX costs are incentivized through the X factor, and clearly, if one looks for improvement of efficiency, the incentive to reduce losses should be part of the controllable costs. In addition, given that CAPEX are assessed in this framework on a project basis, the investment in energy efficient equipment should also be allowed. One issue that comes up here in terms of the OPEX savings that may be attained when investment in energy efficient equipment takes place is that these savings should be allowed for a sufficient period of time. Typically, the regulation period spans some 3 to 5 years, whereas the OPEX savings would entail much larger time spans. And one way to adjust for that would be a gradual adjustment of the operational expenditures based on a long-term average. Alternative to the building blocks is the so-called TOTEX approach, where total costs are assessed. And in this case, controllable costs are incentivized through the X factor as well, while non-controllable costs are passed through to consumers. In this case, regulatory arrangements should also allow for sufficient cost opportunities to retain costs in the OPEX domain, because otherwise adverse incentives might be arising, as CAPEX reduction may also be an opportunity for the regulated entity to increase revenues. Finally, the loss reduction incentive scheme, as discussed briefly before. If suppliers are responsible for procurement, one should still seek to incentivize TSOs and DSOs maybe through an additional element, including an element in the price formula that allows to make additional gains on the basis of reduction of losses for the regulated entity. If we take a quick look at the investment in energy efficient equipment, here we see again the relevance of the difference in time spans between regulation period on the one hand and the impact that the investment in energy efficient equipment may have on operating costs, where in this case, assuming a project with minimum life LCC and an amortization period that is bigger than the regulation period applies, then the cost savings should be allowed to be retained for a sufficient period of time, and that is basically the same notion as in the previous slide, where a gradual adjustment of these costs based on a long-term average should be implemented. In the domain of non-financial incentives for loss reduction, one may resort to a multitude of alternatives. One is the so-called technical standards approach, where one sets mandatory minimum energy efficiency standards for equipment in the network environment. Alternative could be obligations or certificate schemes with specific targets for the grid operators to be met, where we assume trading to be allowed, of course. Other ways to attain or achieve loss reductions could be voluntary agreements, typically non-binding guidelines for grid losses, and alternative would be labeling schemes, where equipment in the market might be labeled in terms of efficiency. And lastly, information campaigns are considered to be potential ways to improve performance. And finally, support for R&D targets and technical measures for grid efficiency. Now, one may outline the different pros and cons or performance profiles of these measures in terms of regulatory fit or embedding, where in this case regulatory fit would be the need to fundamentally adjust the regulatory framework. Secondly, implementation costs are a relevant element where one could consider the administrative costs and political barriers involved. Stakeholder acceptance is a relevant element in terms of does the measure get the support required from both market participants and suppliers of equipment, for example. Economic effects are, of course, relevant in terms of is it leading the system to cost-efficient investments. And finally, and maybe most important, how effective is the measure in terms of attaining a reduction of network losses. And maybe regarding the regulatory embedding, I suppose that most measures will be fairly fitting, although arguably the obligations or certificate schemes are somewhat more complex as they relate to additional potentially significant additional revenues and the control thereof. With regard to the implementation costs, one may note that technical standards require a fairly complex task of technical profiling, which may induce quite a few technical details to come into play. For financial incentives, on the other hand, political decision making and specific measures on a member state level in the European context would be required. So both measures or schemes are therefore assumed to be moderately performing in this respect. The obligation or certificate scheme, however, is assumed to be even more complex, and the requirement on a potential trading scheme would be very complex in comparison to the other approaches, and as such, a somewhat less effective implementation or a relatively high implementation cost is assumed in this respect. With regard to stakeholder acceptance for technical standards and the obligation scheme, again, in the first case, it depends very much on how such a scheme would be set up, but in principle, the scheme will be limiting to the degrees of freedom of grid operators, and as such, presumably somewhat compromising, whereas the obligations or certificate schemes will be judged by stakeholders, presumably very much dependent on the actual implementation, given that it will offer both costs and benefits, and as such there's some uncertainty involved. But I think if I look at economic effects, we can also distinguish a comparable profile for technical standards, in the sense that the measures will presumably be fairly homogeneous, whereas on the other hand, the requirements involved with different systems will be quite different as well, and as such may be somewhat less fitting to each specific situation. For financial incentives, one runs the risk of information asymmetry involved with the regulation on CapEx remuneration. In terms of effectiveness, it's assumed that technical standards will be relatively effective, and somewhat less so, but yet fairly effective as well, financial incentives. Whereas if we look at the ordering in terms of this slide, the effectiveness goes down when we move down to the bottom of the list. In the final slide, we've highlighted the most relevant elements of this assessment, where essentially technical standards are assumed to offer relatively effective measures along with financial incentives, whereas the remainder of the listing offers relatively limited effectiveness. On the other hand, technical standards particularly affect investments, not so much operation, and again, financial incentives may lose on economic efficiency due to the issue of information asymmetry. Now, that brings us to the end of the discussion that we wanted to put forward here, where in the conclusions we can basically state that network losses are a high demand element of the European portfolio, and these losses represent a significant cost. The essence here is that they do not always represent a cost to TSOs and DSOs, depending on how the grid regulation is structured. But if, for example, elements thereof are considered to be non-controllable, such costs are essentially passed through to the end user. Financial incentives facilitating energy efficiency in grid investments will need to induce life cycle costing in the project evaluation, and as such, they will need to allow the required CapEx for the investments in energy efficient equipment. But also they will need to allow the retention of the savings on operating costs. In the particular case of suppliers being the party to procure energy to cover for losses, the incentive scheme should explicitly formulate an additional element targeting grid losses or grid loss reduction for TSOs and DSOs, as in principle the costs of grid losses otherwise are passed through to the suppliers or themselves. Finally, with regard to non-financial incentives, there is a multitude of approaches where in particular technical standards stands out as an effective measure alongside to the financial incentives discussed previously as well. That essentially concludes the presentation of today on incentivization of grid losses. And,
okay, thank you very much, Sebastian, for this presentation today. So now it's time for questions and answers. So please don't hesitate to submit your questions to our speaker today. Meanwhile, I would like to ask you about potential interaction between different initiatives to introduce energy efficiency in networks. So I have in mind an example related to transformers. So on the one side, following the eco-design directive, there might be a request to transformer manufacturers to cope with minimum efficiency levels. But on the other side, regulated utilities, so transmission system operators and especially distribution system operators, will have to face the extra cost of higher efficiency investments. So the question here is how to harmonize this within the regulatory framework. So should the regulators be involved in the process, or should they receive particular instructions? So any comment is welcome. Thank you.
Yes, I think in principle, if you're facing, as a TSO or DSO, are facing the situation where additional expenditures are expected related to investment in energy efficient equipment, particularly in case of the building blocks scheme as discussed before, it will be very relevant that such investments are allowed for by the regulator, so that the investment elements are allowed to enter the RAB as well. That's just one example where the linkage is quite crucial, I think, and as such, I would definitely think that regulators should be involved with such developments.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I think we have another question, so let me turn to the visible ports and let's go ahead with it. So, are there any particular incentives that relate to increasing penetration of distributed generation in the network? Losses could increase or decrease depending on the match between generation and demand.
Yes, that's very true. In principle, if you look at loss reduction on the basis of matching supply and demand and reducing essentially peak load in the network, that would offer an opportunity to reduce losses, of course. Now, in principle, you would imagine that it would be of relevance for grid operators to play a role then in the, for example, demand side management, and also we see in the Energy Efficiency Directive that such is promoted. However, essentially, the incentive for TSOs and DSOs to become active in that domain is related to whether you actually will be able to retain any gains related to the reduction of operating costs, and that is the dominant element here.
Okay, thank you. I would have another question. So today we can find in the market conductors for overhead lines, which are quite sophisticated and quite, let's say, efficient in terms of energy efficiency, but also on current carrying capacity. So I can understand that in most of cases, transmission system operator takes the decision to go for the cheapest conductor in spite of losses, and then disregarding the possibility to use, let's say, more expensive but probably more efficient conductors. How would you recommend to address this point? Is that something that could make sense in the context of the Article 15 of Energy Efficiency Directive? And if so, which avenues would you see to make it happen? Thank you.
Definitely it would make sense in the context of Article 15. And here, again, depending on the framework that one is facing or working with, the main issue here is whether there is any gains for the regulated entity to be expected, any financial gains to be expected upon investment. So, so depending on the structure that one is looking for, looking at, one will need to be allowed to retain any reduction of the operating costs resulting from the installment, while also, if applicable, if relevant, be allowed to get a reasonable rate of return on the original investment.
Okay, good. Okay, so we see that here the regulatory field, a number of things could be done or could be fostered. Okay, so we will probably see in the coming years, following the request of Article 15, a number of proposals by transmission system operators that will definitely need to be addressed by regulators. Okay, if there is any other question, I would invite audience to submit. Otherwise, we will probably adjourn in a few moments. So I will give a few more moments to submit your questions if you have any. Okay, so it seems that it's been all for today. So thank you very much, Sebastian, for your explanations. Hope this will share some clarity to the current regulatory frameworks and the current requests from Energy Efficiency Directive and also Eco-Design Directive. And well, I give you the floor to end this session today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. As far as if I understand, there's no more questions. It was a pleasure to offer this, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.